Dear colleagues, students, and friends, it's my great pleasure to open this two-day colloquium on race and citizenship in the Americas, then and now. And welcome our colleagues from Brazil, the United States, and France. With this colloquium, we are inaugurating the Global Collaborative Network on Race and Citizenship in the Americas, funded by the Council for International Teaching and Research, and hosted by the Program Latin American Studies at Princeton. The network is a 3-year initiative led by Princeton University and the Universidade de São Paulo, USP. Its main goal is to facilitate dialogues between Brazilian universities and Princeton. The network's members include undergraduate and graduate students from both countries, postdoctoral fellows, and professors whose research focuses on race and racism in a comparative perspective in Brazil, the United States, and the Caribbean. As we know, one of Princeton University's long-term projects is the Internationalization Initiative, one product of which has been a recently signed agreement with the Universidade de São Paulo, making it easier for students and professors to circulate and forge agendas that go beyond national and institutional boundaries. The Network on Race and Citizenship in the Americas proposes to foster dialogues that otherwise would be impossible or at least improbable. In discussions with João Biehl, Lídia Schwartz, and Antônio Sérgio Guimarães, with whom I have had the pleasure of co-directing this network, I was often asked in our warm email exchanges and phone and Skype conversations what exactly I had in mind when I suggested an opening session that addresses mestiçagem or mestiçagem as part of a wider perspective on race. Of course, I will not go into much detail, but we all know that the very concept of mestiçagem is often referred to, either in Latin America or in the United States, as a kind of ideological disguise for different forms of racism. That is to say, brandishing mestiçagem would be one way to simply not address the legacy of slavery, as well as blinding us to the daily racism of societies where the one-drop rule has never existed, where segregation did not take the form it took in the United States. The celebration of an idealized, joyful encounter would be, at the same time, the denial of more insidious forms of violence. If I'm not wrong, we have already distanced ourselves from that kind of misconception. In Brazil, those who support affirmative action policies acknowledge, in different degrees, the specificities of different forms of racism that build on color and appearance rather than blood. This, of course, puts us before the huge question faced by post-colonial societies throughout the world of the overlap of race and social class. The existence of different forms of mestiçagem, though, suggests the urgency of addressing historical experiences in a comparative way, in order to understand what Sergio Kosinski provocatively called the alchemy of cultures that emerge. Par quelle alchimie les cultures se mélangent-elles? What is this 0 degree of transformation? But in a time when all essentialists seem to have been proscribed, can we still speak of a specific moment when one turns into another in face of the other? Can we talk about a moment when clashing cultures offer us the goal of a new, perhaps more humane condition? Or is this just a silly and dangerous angst? In the freshman seminar I've been teaching at Princeton with Lídia Schwartz on race and the history of racism in Brazil, we've come across that striking passage recounted by Antônio Sérgio Guimarães, in which French sociologist and anthropologist Roger Bastide, right after meeting Gilberto Freire in Recife in 1944, describes an interesting scene and uses, much before Freire himself, that strange term, racial democracy. And I quote Bastide. I returned to the city by streetcar. It was full of workers going home from the factory who mixed their tired bodies with those of day trippers returning from Dois Irmãos Park. A population of mestizos, whites and blacks, gathered fraternally, squeezed together, crammed onto each other in an enormous and friendly confusion of arms and legs. Close to me, a black man, exhausted by the day's efforts, let his sleepy head, covered in sweat, droop onto the shoulder of an office worker, a white man who carefully adjusted his shoulders to nest the head as if to caress it. And this was the beautiful image of social and racial democracy that Recife offered me on my way back from the outskirts of the city at sunset. End of quote. I hope to make myself clear. I'm not subscribing to Roger Bastide's fantasy, which should be understood as a fantasy that could be understood as one more step towards a widely spread idealization of Brazil dating from the mid-40s, a time when the Nazi nightmare begged to be substituted with the dream of happy encounter. But let me return to a question we like to ask our students. Isn't it interesting that one of the symbolic pillars of the civil rights movement in the United States points to the moment when Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat in the colored section of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama? Or is this just a tricky way of seeing the history of racism in the United States against the backdrop of a supposedly less racist country? For 2 days, we will hear a wonderful group of scholars discussing from different perspectives and diverse views the experience of a country that cannot and should not take any pride in its own forms of racism. There are no benevolent forms of colonialism and racism. Nevertheless, this assertion does not elude the fact that there are differences, and differences that are not solely the product of intellectual fantasy, neither the simple result of a nationalistic project of cultural amalgamation. I believe we can and should address such differences. In order to do so, we may find it necessary to embark on a balance between location and globalization in order to find values that can be shared, even when they are still racialized, still classed, still gendered, to use Deborah Thomas' insightful remix words, which strike a chord with Arcadio Diaz-Quiñones' quest for those moments when traditions are not the safeguards to prevent changes, but rather constitute possible new beginnings. Before I hand things over to my dear colleague and friend João, who will moderate the opening session of this colloquium and introduce our first speakers and discussants, I would like to express our deep gratitude to colleagues, students, and staff members who made this possible. First, to our guests from the Universidade de São Paulo, Universidade Federal da Bahia, Fundação Oswaldo Cruz, Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, Pontifícia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro, Brown University, École de Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and the University of Pennsylvania. I thank my colleagues in the program in Latin American Studies at Princeton, especially its director, Rubén Gallo, my colleagues in the Spanish and Portuguese department, its chair, Gabriela Musei, Jeremy Edelman from the Council for International Teaching and Research, Bruno Carvalho and Eddie Teles, who are my partners in the organization of the Brazil Monday Seminar at Princeton, and finally, some of the founding and most important members of Plas, Stanley J. Stein, who was the first Plas director, Arcadio Diaz-Quinones, who was also the Plas director, and James Irby, who actually introduced Portuguese in the curriculum at Princeton. I also would like to thank Silvana Bishop and Karen Gonzalez from Spanish and Portuguese. And finally, the wonderful staff of Plas, Rosalia Rivera, Gillian Lenihan-Halby, and Ada Toner, as well as Spanish and Portuguese major Flora Thompson-DeVoe, who take care of the pictures. And last but not least, the infallible Marcelo da Rocha Lima Diego. On the institutional level, we are happy to have the support of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Languages and Cultures and the Department of Anthropology. And, of course, the academic openness and equally strong support of the Universidade de São Paulo. I now welcome you all. Bem-vindos, bienvenidos, bienvenue, and I wish you all an excellent colloquium. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, for your vision, your hard work, and your beautiful and inspiring words that open this colloquium. I want to not say many words, but I want to read you a quote that has been a compass in my own work, but it resonates deeply with a few of the themes and expressions that Pedro used in his own opening statement. He talked about, not impossible. He talked then the beginnings of the possible. And I want to read a quote from Albert Hirschman, the wonderful economist, thinker, as Jeremy would say, worldly philosopher, in his forthcoming biography of Albert Hirschman, who left us this year. And Albert Hirschman, I think, has inspired several of us, many of us, and he's been a dear friend of Latin America. And he always looked for those signs of what's possible, that he started to call possibilism, that's out there, to engage the unexpected, that which is possible, that does not come from the models or from the probabilities or from our own expectations of people or the social or what the political should be. And he said in identifying those things and engaging them with people on the ground, at stake is, quote, to defend the right to a non-projected future as one of the truly inalienable rights of every person and nation, and to set the stage for conceptions of change to which the inventiveness of history and a passion for the possible are admitted as vital actors. So with these words, I want to welcome you all to this conference, and we are so fortunate and we are so happy to have this amazing group of scholars for our opening panel. Arcadio Diaz-Quinones from Princeton, Sergei Gruzinski from the École des Aptitudes from Princeton, and Deborah Thomas from the University of Pennsylvania. And as discussants, we will have Lilia Schwartz from the University of São Paulo, and also a Princeton Global Scholar, and Antonio Sergio Guimarães from the University of São Paulo. So we have this wonderful band of worldly thinkers, blending history, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, and literature. And it couldn't start on a better note of interdisciplinarity and engagement with what matters most to people in the perspective of what might be possible. So let's give our panelists a warm welcome, and let's begin.